Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
A spacious mirrored elevator slowly descended to the first floor of a huge business center. There was only one person inside. Charles happened to be the only employee in his own company who stayed late. Coming out into the lobby, the businessman politely said goodbye to the security guard. The older man nodded understandingly to the director and smiled. "You're out late again, Charles. You should at least take a couple of days off from yourself. You don't get any rest at all." The businessman only shook his hands. "I wish I could, Zach, but then who would do the work for me? Our business is such that you have to keep your hand on the pulse every minute. Anything, get distracted, and everything immediately goes in the wrong direction." The elderly guard just shook his head in response, saying that our director is a workaholic. He got into the soft leather interior of his car, started the engine, and in a couple of minutes drove out of the service parking lot toward the city at night. On the way home, the man involuntarily plunged into his own thoughts and memories. The company, which Charles took over not long ago, was a serious breakthrough for his career. The young man, who celebrated his 35th birthday last year, had worked for almost 8 years to take his team to international level. Some of Charles' acquaintances wondered how it was possible for a simple orphanage boy to have the business acumen of a hereditary millionaire entrepreneur. The young man always answered that it was only a desire to live a better life, and everything else would come with it. In any case, in his life, that is how it turned out. Charles really spent his childhood and most of his youth in an orphanage. This, perhaps more than anything else, hardened the character of the future businessman. From a young age, Charles was used to assert his right to almost everything, whether it was personal belongings, toys, or an opportunity to be alone with himself in peace. After the orphanage, the boy immediately enrolled in college, where he chose to become an engineer, as he had always been interested in the construction of complex mechanisms. After graduating with honors, Charles almost immediately managed to get a job at an industrial enterprise, where he worked in his specialty for several years before he realized that on a modest salary of a simple engineer, in New York it is incredibly difficult to live. When he got a job as an assistant manager in the same holding company that he heads today, Charles began to learn the basics of business in the field. At first, it wasn't easy because he didn't understand many things. But thanks to a mentor who saw his potential, he was able to slowly learn about the industry he was in. After some more time, he began to climb up the career ladder. First, he headed the department, then reached the position of deputy, and finally ended up where he was today. The only thing that seriously overshadowed Charles' life was the absence of a family of his own. He had girlfriends, of course, and even a first love that he would never be able to forget, but he never experienced true happiness. With Emily, his last sweetheart, the businessman honestly tried to build a family, but nothing good came of it. They were married for 3.5 years, but during that time they could not have children, even though Charles wanted them very much. The couple's health was fine, but the reason for their forced childlessness was banal. Emily herself flatly refused to have children. "Charles, you know very well that my answer is no, for the 100th time." The beautiful wife explained to her husband, "I'm not going to ruin my figure, and then for God knows how many years, to live for some squealing and eternally snotty creature. I want to live for myself. I am, after all, only 24 years old. A lot of people my age don't even think about having kids yet." But Emily, the businessman, objected. "I'm in my 30s. I want a normal family and children, not a wife who is all day long bouncing around all kinds of parties and beauty salons. Let's try it. You don't know for sure. Maybe you'll like it." The maternal instinct, from what I hear, is a very powerful thing. Emily only raised her gracefully arched eyebrow contemptuously and said slowly, "Well, yes, a thing so strong that your own mother rejected you, and you spent half your life in an orphanage. No, I don't want that happiness. Thank you." Charles went all pale with anger and resentment. How could she speak to him like that? It was now that the man fully understood that all Lyra wanted from him was money and access to high society. But back then, shortly after this conversation, Charles filed for divorce himself. He simply could no longer live under the same roof with such a cold-blooded and cynical egotist. And recently, he heard rumors that Emily was having an affair with another millionaire, but Charles was no longer interested. And so it turned out that now Charles was all alone. It seems that he had achieved career heights, and he had enough money for everything that he could not even dream of as a child. But his soul was still cold and empty. Charles realized that he had no one to live for, and that made his future existence seem hazy and joyless. But inside, it was as if everything in him was stale with disappointment and resentment, as if he had long ago been an old man who had no more desires in this life. He could afford a lot, but neither social events nor gambling and all other entertainment of the rich. He was not interested at all. "Oh, Charles, you really are working too hard today." The businessman grinned to himself as he parked the car in his own underground garage. "I should go to bed early tonight, get a good night's sleep." With these thoughts in mind, Charles leisurely made his way to another elevator, which, this time, would take him directly to the 20th floor, to his beautiful two-story apartment. The next day, after having lunch at his favorite restaurant, Charles hurried back, glancing at his watch. In 40 minutes, he had an appointment with an important partner. However, when the man approached the car, he froze in amazement. A little boy, about 10 years old, very poorly dressed, and with disheveled reddish blonde hair, was squatting beside his car. A 5-liter canister was at the boy's feet, along with a long, flexible hose. All this construction, the boy had cleverly adapted to the gas tank hatch for the crafty thing to do. "Hey, boy, what are you doing?" Charles was indignant. He quickly walked up to the child and ripped the rubber hose out of his hands. "Didn't they teach you in school that stealing is bad?" The boy's face immediately contorted with fear and shame. He clearly hadn't expected to run into the owner of the car. Although it was daytime outside, the boy was able to get behind Charles' car in such a way that he was unlikely to be seen by anyone. "I'm sorry, Uncle," the kid said, wiping his dirty face with the sleeve of his jacket. I won't do it again. Really." The boy looked at Charles frightened, sniffing his nose. An old, shabby backpack was hanging behind his back. The kid must have been in school, but he must have been out after school. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you," said Charles conciliatorily, and held out his hand for the baby to get up. "Thank you." The boy thanked him, shaking the dust off his old, shabby pants at the same time. "My name is Steve, by the way, and I live nearby. What's yours?" Charles, the businessman, smiled back and shook his outstretched, small hand. "Don't think, Charles. I don't leak gasoline from cars and sell it," the boy explained. "We just don't have much to live on and nothing to eat at home. My stepfather is a heavy drinker. He used to work at a construction site, and then he hurt his arm. He's been drinking every day since. He swears and yells all the time. I don't know what to do anymore." "What about your mother?" softly asked the man. "I don't know," Steve sobbed and rubbed his eyes again, trying to stop the tears from coming back. "My stepfather says she left us and went to New York to find a new husband, but I don't believe it. I think my mom went to the big city to work. It's been a year now, and I miss her a lot." Steve tried his best to hold back the tears, but they flowed treacherously down his cheeks, smeared with soot and machine oil. Charles didn't know what to do. He felt sorry for the boy. Something in his heart felt like it had burst, like the thick crust of ice that had surrounded his soul all this time suddenly gave way to a thin, twisting crack. Finally, he patted the boy on the shoulder soothingly. There, little one. Don't cry. I'm sure your mother will be back soon, and she'll explain everything to you. Who knows what her circumstances are in New York? Grown-ups have different problems every day." Steve calmed down a little and looked up at the businessman, full of despair and longing. "Uncle Charles," the boy suddenly said, "can I stay with you? At least just for a week, because my stepfather started drinking a lot of alcohol, and he's gone completely insane. He's fighting." The boy's voice trembled so pitifully that Charles's heart involuntarily cringed. "But how do you imagine that, Steve?" The businessman asked him, confused. "Only for a week, I promise. I'll behave myself, don't worry, and I won't disturb you." Charles looked at the boy with both pity and affection. He wouldn't mind taking him in, but how would his guardian take it? Please, Uncle Charles. You're a kind man, I can tell by the way you look at you. All right, said Charles. Let me take you to work now, and then we'll go to your house tonight and warn your stepfather. Or else he might come looking for you and call the police. Thank you. The boy thanked him warmly. You won't regret it, I promise. That day, for the first time in years, Charles left work much earlier than usual. He stopped at a cafe on the way, fed his little friend, and then went with him to Steve's address, the house where they lived with his mother and stepfather. The door was opened by a tall, unshaven man with a half-empty bottle of liquor clutched in his hand. Peter, that was Steve's stepfather's name, gave off a horrible smell of breath, and his faded tank top was covered with dry ketchup and other food scraps. When Peter saw the kid, he grinned nastily, and leaning against the door jamb, he said in a drunken voice, "Oh, you've come, have you? Where have you been all this time, you bastard? I've been waiting for you. You've been getting on my nerves. I'll talk to you later." Charles coughed cautiously, forcing the alcoholic to pay attention to himself. He struggled to focus his gaze on Charles's face, and then gave a short yell. "I won't give you any money." "What, you think you brought my ragamuffin to a shelter so you get something out of it too?" "Ah, you got the wrong guy. Actually, I wanted to ask you to let the child go with me," Charles tried to say as calmly as possible. The businessman took his business card out of his pocket and handed it to the boy's drunken stepfather. As he twisted it in his hands, studying the name of Charles's company, Charles spoke. "I'm not going to hurt your son, don't worry. Think of it as a kind of vacation from the baby for you. I see that you have more important things to do than take care of Steve, so I suggest you take him away for about a week." When Peter tore his eyes away from the miniature card, his eyes were full of suspicion and greed. "Where's the guarantee that you'll give me my boy back?" He took a big gulp from the bottle and asked. "Vaughn's mother dumped me, hung up the little rascal, and was like this. She took off to New York, doesn't call or write." Steve hid behind Charles' back, while the businessman's own face twisted with anger. "Well, I should call and write in such a monstrous situation. And not only to the police, but also to the child welfare authorities, and to report to them the intolerable conditions under which this poor boy is being raised. But I don't want Steve to go to an orphanage, because I know what it will be like for him there." Peter slowly folded his arms across his chest and said in an insolent tone, "Look, let's not ruin each other's lives, okay? You give me compensation for the kid, like an insurance premium, so I don't get bored, and I'll let you have Steve just for 7 days. If you want to extend it, you're welcome. You know where to find me now." Peter laughed drunkenly, and Charles's insides went cold. It was the meanest, lowest sentence he had ever heard. Gritting his teeth, the businessman said, "All right, even though you're a rare bastard, I'll give you the money, but only to save the boy from such a monster." The man took a thick wad of bills out of his pocket and forcefully placed them into the alcoholic's sweaty hands. The man, not expecting the profit from the stepson to be so decent, even grunted with pleasure. "Come on, Steve," Charles said to the boy, and gave him a gentle nudge to start down the stairs. Charles himself turned back to Peter and said, looking into his eyes with the fury of which only a man who had known the bitterness and pain of betrayal was capable, "I hope you choke on that money, because scumbags like you only deserve it." With these words, Charles left the stairwell, promising himself mentally that he would do everything in his power to make sure Steve never returned to that disgusting place again. Charles was genuinely glad that he had the opportunity to feel, if not like a real father, then at least like a normal guardian for the boy. For the next week, he helped Steve with his homework, played board games with him. The boy was, to Charles's amazement, very bright and attentive, and generally took care of the child as best he could. In addition, the businessman took the boy to a large mall, where he bought him many new clothes and shoes, and even a modern and lightweight backpack to make it easier for Steve to go to school with him. Needless to say, how happily the boy smiled every time Charles came home from work. Steve was incredibly grateful to the businessman for showing him a normal human life in which he didn't have to steal anything and live in constant fear. One evening, as Charles was putting the boy's school books into his new backpack, he noticed a photograph fall out of his school diary. When he picked it up, the young millionaire was immediately dumbfounded. "Geez, Steve, who is this woman?" Barely containing the excitement in his voice, Charles asked the boy, showing him the picture he had found. The boy looked at the photo and simply answered, "So that's my mom, Betty." "Betty?" the businessman asked him again. "Betty?" "Well, yes," the boy replied, and stroked the picture lightly with his fingertips. "She's a beautiful mother, isn't she?" At these words, Steve became visibly sad, and he spoke softly. "Oh, Mommy, where are you? If you only knew how much I'm waiting for you." The reason Charles was so shocked when he saw the picture of the boy's mother was because he knew the young woman well. Once upon a time, 11 years ago, when Charles himself was 24, he had fallen madly in love with Betty, whose parents at the time were very successful merchants in the agricultural industry. For Charles, who at the time was just beginning his career with the Betty's family, they were seen as celestials. The boy, who had grown up in an orphanage, could never have imagined that he would meet a family so wealthy by his standards. Charles met Betty by chance at a book fair, and almost immediately a spark flashed between the two young people, which later turned into the flames of a stormy and passionate romance. The guy could not believe his luck. He had never loved anyone as much as this wonderful girl, with a luxurious mop of reddish blonde hair. And then he got the businessman's daughter pregnant, which ruined everything. The girl's parents insisted on an abortion, even though Betty wanted to have a baby with Charles. But the Betty's family did not want such a poor son-in-law as Charles. They wanted to send their daughter abroad to study. They thought the affair was all frivolous, a childish infatuation. Betty, at the time, was 21. The girl's sudden pregnancy ruined everything, so Betty's family was determined to make her break up with her fiancé by any means necessary. Of course, Charles himself knew nothing of this. But he remembered for the rest of his life the bitter and painful feeling when Betty called him on their last date, where she told him, "I'm sorry, Charles, but it's over between us." Betty spoke firmly, but there were tears in her eyes. He could not and would not believe his ears. No, why are you lying to me?" Charles whispered to her, looking at her with a mute plea. "I don't want to see you anymore," Betty whispered and turned away. Charles wanted to go to her and hold her in his arms, to comfort her. But he froze in place when he heard the following words. "Don't come near me. This is our last meeting. We'll never see each other again because I'm leaving." "But Betty," Charles objected in a colorless voice. "What about our child? Have you thought of him? No, I won't let you go anywhere. There is no more baby." She sharply saddled him with her lover. "I did it, and now you and I have nothing more in common." Charles then felt as if a huge knife had been plunged into him. His heart was stabbed, so black in his eyes, and it seemed for a moment that all the air in his lungs instantly turned to liquid flame so unbearable was it to hear such terrible words from his first, and as time had shown, only love. "Betty," Charles could only whisper, "How could you? How could you take the life of our child? Go away, please." She said without turning around, "Everything that's happened between us is one big mistake." The girl's shoulders still shook with silent sobs as Charles left the scene of their last meeting. Many years had passed since then, and he still couldn't forgive himself for leaving so easily, and he didn't try, emotionlessly, to find out from his beloved what had happened. But youth, as we know, is usually guided by heart and emotion rather than reason. It was only now, sitting in his enormous living room, gazing intently into Steve's clear blue eyes and his reddish blonde hair, that Charles thought, for the first time, that in terms of timing, this boy might well have been his own son. Could it really be true? Thought to himself, with secret hope, the businessman. God, if Steve is my son, that changes absolutely everything. But in order to be sure, I need to find his mother, Betty. Only she can give me all the answers. The man was so excited that he didn't immediately think to do a DNA test. Charles took one more look at the photo of his former lover, then carefully put it back in the boy's diary. Now he was determined to track down his young lodger's mother. The man engaged several private investigators for this purpose. 2 more weeks passed, during which time Steve still lived in the businessman's apartment. Charles kept his promise to himself and sent, with the help of a courier, an impressive sum of money to the negligent drunken stepfather. The man was willing to do anything so that the boy would not have to return to the hell in which he had been forced to live until now. Finally, the search yielded results. Betty was found in New York hospice. The woman did not want to frighten her son, so under the pretext of earning money, she went there to be examined. The doctors diagnosed her with a serious illness in the last stage. The detective reported to Charles on the phone, "Nothing can be done. Unfortunately, all too advanced," so she was transferred to a hospice. "My God," the businessman said in response, "if only I had known about this before." The doctor, whom we persuaded to share information with us, said she did not have long to live. The only thing that can be done is to relieve her suffering with painkillers. Charles thanked the detective and hung up. The man was at a loss. Well, he found Betty, and then what? Even if he could talk to her, how could he look her in the eye after all these years? But at the same time, Charles felt a painful prick of conscience. She was lying there, all alone. Well, am I the mellow one? Charles thought to himself, no, I have to go and see Betty for sure. So the man quickly packed up and drove to his ex-lover's house. He didn't say anything to the boy yet. What was the use of frightening the child before his time? When Charles arrived at the hospice and found out where the woman was lying, he immediately went to her room. The woman lying in front of him on the hospital bed was incredibly thin and pale. There was almost nothing left of Kira's former beauty, except that only her hair still retained its amazing and warm color. Betty. Charles said her name carefully. "Do you recognize me?" "It's me, Charles." Charles. She slowly lifted her head on the pillow, as if she had almost no strength left, and peered intently into the man's face. Her eyes misted over, as if she were remembering something. "Charles," she muttered weakly and smiled. It was enough for the businessman to rush to her bed and take the poor woman by the hand. "Betty, honey, how could this happen to you?" Charles asked her, and then he told her about his son and Peter. Finally, he asked his ultimate question. "Yes," Betty exhaled almost silently and leaned back on the pillow. "Stephen really is your son, Charles. It's lucky you got him away from that alcoholic. That's why I wanted to come here, to get checked out. I wasn't feeling well." It turned out to be a one-way ticket. It's good that I was assigned here. They take care of me, and most importantly, they give me painkillers, although they almost do not help. I do not want my son to see how I fade. It's better to let him think that I will come back to him someday. Charles squeezed his former lover's fingers sympathetically, then asked in a quiet voice, "Why then, did you lie to me? When was the last time we saw each other?" Betty looked at him with genuine regret. "Parents. I just couldn't go against their will. I couldn't get an abortion, either," the woman added after a second. "I did live in England for a while, though, before Stephen was born. My mother and father didn't want the shame, so they decided to send me out of sight and away." Betty sighed and immediately coughed, a sound that literally broke Scarl's heart. "When Stephen was born, I came back. What was I to do in a country where I had no one at all? My mother didn't know what to do. How to explain it to my surroundings if they suddenly got wind of my pregnancy and the baby? But at least she was happy that I was coming, unlike my father." Betty turned her head tiredly to the other side. Every word seemed to be incredibly difficult for her. Then he died. He crashed in a car accident. He was coming from a corporate party, and apparently he drank too much, because later they found a large dose of alcohol in his blood. Mom started drinking with grief, and it all hit her so fast and hard that she only outlived Dad by a year. The business went down the drain. What could I do? Alone with a little baby in my arms? The house had been repossessed by the bank, as had all our possessions. The accounts had been frozen, and they had also been turned over to pay off the many loans that Dad had racked up. I had no choice but to take a job as a cleaner in order to make ends meet and to be able to look after my son. He's waiting for you. He keeps asking where his mother is. Charles tried to smile at her through his tears. You gave birth to a wonderful son. Our wonderful son. She corrected him. Charles, promise me that you will not leave our boy alone. He has no one else." "I swear," the businessman assured her fervently. "But you also promise me that you won't give up Betty." "Not this time. I'll do anything to make you and Steve happy." The boy's mother smiled at Charles with a calm, kind smile. "You know, I always wanted to give our Stephen a karate class. He gets hurt a lot at school, teased, kind of like the son of a technician, but he doesn't stand for it. He always fought and made everybody who hurt him or me regret what he had said. He's got the spirit of a fighter, just like you." Charles, instead of answering, pressed his lips to Kira's fingers and felt hot tears gush from his eyes at that moment. The businessman was ready to do anything to hire the best doctors he could find in New York to save the mother of his child. Unfortunately, however, money can't always make things right. "Alas, we did everything we could," the doctor told the businessman the next morning. "It all happened too quickly. Her body simply could not cope, but we are not gods. This disease, alas, cannot be cured." "My God, why?" The grief-stricken Charles raged. "Why was I too late? If I had found her sooner, things might have been different." The doctor looked at him with genuine regret. "Charles, don't beat yourself up. Even if we had been able to start treatment in time, it could not have guaranteed Betty a full recovery." The businessman felt his heart clench with wild force. His chest began to stab, and the man slowly sank down on a soft couch in the hospital corridor. "Charles, are you unwell?" The doctor got worried. "Let me tell the nurse and she will give you a sedative. Let's go to the room." No need, I'm fine," the businessman said heavily. "Just let me be alone. That woman meant a lot to me." Alone, Charles couldn't hold back the tears that came to his eyes. Pressing his hands to his face, he groaned with grief. How could this happen? Why? He didn't have time. The only woman in his life for whom he had truly serious and deep feelings never waited for him to help. Charles couldn't shake the thought that if he had found Betty sooner, all of this could have been avoided. Steve would have grown up with them. Stephen's little boy. The businessman rose to his feet with great difficulty. The ground beneath him swayed like the deck of a ship, and his legs were as padded as a rag doll. His heart ached and ached. It seemed that the man had aged 10 years in a couple of hours. He had to explain everything to his son, to prepare him for a difficult conversation. As he reached his car, Charles began to think about what he was going to say to the boy on the way home. When he entered the apartment, he found little Steve anxious, as if he had a premonition that something bad was about to happen. "Uncle Charles, what's wrong?" the boy asked in a trembling voice, looking anxiously at the man. "Steve, I think you and I have a lot to talk about." When Charles told the boy about his mother's death and confessed that he was his real father, Steve's face displayed mixed feelings. On the one hand, he was glad to have such a wonderful father as Charles. But on the other, "Daddy, does that mean Mom is gone? Will she never come back to me again?" My son's eyes turned red, and he started rubbing them again, trying, out of habit, to stifle the tears. The businessman sighed heavily. "Mom will always watch over you from heaven, son. Before she left, she asked me to do everything I could to make sure you grew up happy and learned what a real, loving family is. She loved you very much, Steve." The boy lowered his eyes and huddled silently against his father. A moment later, his little body began to shudder in silent sobs. "Cry, son, cry." Charles stroked him on the back. "Sometimes we need to get everything out of our system. You'll feel better. In time." 15 years later, Stephen has grown into a tall, athletic, handsome man, with his mother's beautiful reddish blonde hair and his father's clear blue eyes. Charles, by then a sedate, gray-haired businessman, celebrated his 50th birthday and gradually began to hand over the reins of the company to his son. In the intervening years, Charles had given his son the best education in economics and law, making him a worthy successor. Stephen, for his part, did his best to live up to his father's expectations. His excellent education, his incredible eagerness to learn new things, and his natural ability did the trick. The boy was doing just fine. Charles himself, by this time, was hardly involved in the firm's affairs. He wanted his son to do most of the big deals himself. "I've done my part," Charles chuckled. Now it's your turn to carry on the family business. He still needs new blood, work for the future, so to speak. And I can trust no one in this business as you, my son." Stephen, in response to this, only laughed. "You, father, with your energy and physical form, you will shut anyone else up." Charles always looked at his son with pride at such moments, and at the same time, he involuntarily remembered his mother and his first love, Betty. In all these years, the businessman never married. His feelings for Steve's late mother were too strong. "Well, I guess I'm a one-woman man," his father used to say to his son at such moments. The businessman was well aware that he would never meet another woman like Betty, and he saw no point in trading for anything less. One day, Charles Jr., he took his father's last name right after he was adopted, got suspicious that there was a mole in the company. It so happened that their firm failed several profitable international contracts, which for some unknown reason passed into the hands of their competitors. The information that was used to conclude the deals could not leak outside the company, so Stephen decided to find out which of the insiders had set him up. It couldn't be any other way. Any employee with access to important documents could be the mole. When the detectives hired by the young businessman figured out exactly who was passing on all the information to his competitors, the situation suddenly got out of hand. Stephen was involved in a terrible car accident, as the police later found out, completely planned by someone who clearly did not want to be caught in the act. The inconsolable Charles realized at once that it was the work of his old rivals. There was simply no one else. The businessman bemoaned himself for not taking part in the investigation in time. Now, because of his oversight, his son lay in a coma. Stephen had survived, but there was little chance that he would regain consciousness. Charles Sr. used all his contacts at the Ministry of Health, called in the best specialists, but no one gave guarantees for the recovery of his only and dearly loved son. Charles spent days and nights beside Yuri's hospital bed, but he did not know what else he could do to save his son's life. Desperate, Charles went to church. He had not believed in God before, but now he was ready on his knees to ask the Almighty for Steve's recovery. Suddenly, among the several women serving on the altars and the offering tables, Charles noticed someone familiar. Someone's face, flashed in the darkness of the church, made all the blood in the businessman's veins turn to ice. "God, Betty," the man whispered, and slowly moved toward the servants. One of them, in a simple dark gray dress, black blouse, and headscarf, stood quietly picking up the remains of burnt-out candles from one of the tall, gilded candlesticks. Her face, Charles thought, was an exact replica of that of his deceased first love. But how was that possible? "Excuse me," the businessman turned to her. "May I have a word with you?" The woman looked at the millionaire incomprehensibly, but nodded. As they stepped aside, Charles told her about the amazing coincidence between his and Betty's appearance. But the humble servant knew nothing of it, and was also left completely confused. "As far as I know, I was an only child in the family," Miranda, the doppelganger's name, said at a loss. "Maybe it's just a coincidence? You know, God gives people all sorts of different appearances. But sometimes it happens so that completely alien people turn out to be very similar." "I don't think it's just a coincidence, Miranda," said Charles, shaking his head. "The resemblance is too great. I think there is some mystery here." Once again giving his detectives an assignment, Charles Sr. discovers a truth truly shocking to him. It turns out that Betty and Miranda are twin sisters. Their mother, Nancy, had once worked as a maid in Betty's family home. The woman got pregnant with twins, but her fiancé died, and the girl's mother risked being left without any support and livelihood. That's when the Betts spouses who, it turned out, could not have children for physiological reasons offered Nancy to give them one daughter at birth. The rich men promised to take care of the child and give the girl everything she needed, and even more, and the couple gave the maid herself a huge cash settlement. Thanks to this money, Kira and Luda's mother was able to leave town to start a new life. Betty, on the other hand, when she was born, the woman actually gave Betty to Betty's family, and they processed all the paperwork as if she were their own daughter. Except that Miranda never knew that she somewhere had a twin sister. The girl grew up in modesty and always felt her closeness to God, And that is why, as soon as she had such an opportunity, she got a job at a church. That's where Charles met her. The millionaire, shocked, went back to the temple. And when he met Luda, he told her everything he had learned. Struck to the core, the servant burst into tears, and Charles Sr. began to calm her down. He told her that Luda also has a nephew who is now in a coma, and more than ever needs the support of those close to him. Of course, I will do everything in my power for Steve. I will pray for him, maybe. God will hear this prayer and help our boy to wake up. It so happens that Miranda herself has never been married or had children. That is why the fact that she had a relative, the woman took as a real miracle. Going to the hospital to see Steve, Miranda began to pray diligently. In the meantime, Charles was able, through his own channels, to discover the names of the scoundrels who had caused his son's accident. It was, as Charles Sr. suspected, his old rivals who had been targeting his company for several years. After collecting all the necessary evidence, the man went to the police and at the same time brought them reports on the perpetrators of their illegal financial activities. To the great relief of Charles, the bastards were immediately arrested. A couple of weeks later, in the hospital ICU room, the real miracle happened. Stephen Charles came out of his coma. When the young man woke up, before he could even open his eyes, he said in a weak voice, "Mommy, I hear your voice. I'm coming, Mommy." When Stephen saw a woman sitting in front of him who looked exactly like his mother, he thought he was already in paradise, but Miranda explained everything to him and calmed him down. "Hang in there, honey. God has counted that you still have a lot of important things to do on earth. It's too soon for you to go to my sister." Shocked, Stephen found the strength to embrace the woman. One way or another, she was a family member to him too. Charles liked Miranda's modesty and meekness, and their resemblance to Betty only strengthened this sympathy. Miranda, though she was a man of God, always dreamed of having a family, and when all these events happened in her life, she understood that it was a sign from above. Now all three of them lived together in a large and beautiful country house. Charles and Miranda were married, having gone a long way from being friends to being faithful spouses. The feelings between them unfolded slowly, like a rare and beautiful flower, but all the more precious was this unusual love, as if it had passed through generations and moved from Betty's soul into Miranda's heart. Charles and Miranda understood that, at their age, dizzying passion was a thing of the past, so they enjoyed a quiet relationship, mutual loyalty, and respect for each other. In a sense, their family was completely reunited, and Stephen was okay with two of his closest people deciding to tie their lives together. After all, there was a part of his mother in Miranda too, and his father finally, for the first time in years, looked perfectly happy. Truly they say, God's ways are inscrutable, and life with its amazing events and incredible intertwining. Every time does not get tired of reminding us of this.